Assalamu alaikum, good evening. Welcome to the final ADSD session of day one. I'd like to begin by thanking EPC and Dr. Ibtisam Al-Kidbi for the kind invitation and having us here. And an extraordinary thanks to those that remain with us at the end of a very long marathon, double marathon day. So mabruk alaikum, congratulations, well done. I'd like to, we're going to introduce the star-studded lineup and our colleagues who are joining us from Madrid and I believe Shanghai in just a moment. But just a little bit of scene setting, some buzzwords, some synonyms, some alliteration if I may. So just thinking a little bit about futures, fault lines and finances as they pertain to China MENA. And this is a segue into tomorrow's session and the theme for tomorrow. I'd like us to think a little bit about the SIIS when it comes to tech competition. So comparative advantage, competitiveness, containment, connectivity, competitive advantage, and of course, competition, and so on and so forth. We hope to explore the Ds. Here we're speaking digital divides, dividends, disaggregation, and decoupling, a word that we heard a couple of times during the day today. And then finally, akin to the energy equilibria, which we just heard about, I think tech and energy have echoes or rhymes, if you like, when it comes to the A's, and that's affordability, accessibility, and availability. And here we're thinking about laggards, haves and have-nots, jabs and jab-nots, as we saw with the vaccine diplomacy situation and vaccine upkeep and uptake and distribution. So I think we have to think about the same when it comes to the poorer countries or LDICs when it comes to the role of tech. So what for AI and IA, or artificial intelligence and international affairs? What for quantum computing? What for a Geneva or a Budapest Convention, something we may come to? 5G and 6G. Saudi and UAE have been incredibly active in that space. What for the war over semiconductors, something that we heard a couple of times today? How will China weave its metaphorical digital Silk Road across Middle East and Africa, BRI, DP ports, world warts and all? What level of onshoring, nearshoring and friendshoring are we likely to see in the coming decades? A big question. We saw the US CHIP Act earlier this year. We also saw export controls from the US to China on advanced computing and semiconductor manufacturing. We learned last month that the US, believe it or not, has been wargaming the takeover of TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And one of these scenarios, or worst case, would be an evacuation of engineers, while another includes a scorched earth policy, a la France, in parts of Africa, but that's a conversation for another day. Will we see more blue or red supply chains, or can countries like the UAE maintain, preserve, consolidate, and further a purple supply chain, blue and red mixed up for those that didn't attend art in school? In a bifurcated reality, one must also ask, what will the corollary of a competitive duality lead for the loss of revenue and in turn losses when it comes to innovative endeavor? Very big questions. On the entire digitalization of MENA, estimates from the World Bank have it that we could see an entire digitalization from Cairo to Casablanca through to Marrakesh to Muscat. We could see some 46% increase in GDP over the next 30 years, or $1.6 trillion, to Saudi Arabia's and change. Just a few stats. Now, with the mini sample we have in this room, and I'm going to get to our colleagues in just a sec, the sample is quality over quantity in this instance. But just a show of hands, and for those that aren't looking up or looking on your phones, if I could have your attention for just a second. So Elon Musk's Twitter takeover, right? And company-level reform or governance reform. Is it a good thing for public and political discourse? A raise of hands, yes, if you think it's a good thing, and keep your hands down if you think it's a bad thing. So people think it's a bad thing. Another one, by the year 2040, will the US maintain a qualitative, to use that term, for those that know what I'm referring to, a qualitative edge as the tech superpower? Hands up if you think yes, and hands up if you think no. Hands down. So we have a minority who believe that US will maintain a qualitative edge. Very interesting. And then finally, and then we're going to go to our esteemed speakers, the experts proper. When thinking about US-China tech competition, and to challenge Dr. Gargash from this morning, will countries like the UAE, like Saudi, like Qatar, and the broader G's, will they be forced to take sides and pick models? If you believe so, you could raise your hands, and if you believe that navigation and circumvention is possible, maintain your hands in the current position. Interesting. So we think that a few people a couple of the countries have to take sides. Now, on to our speakers. We're planning to keep the conversation dynamic, fluid, and so on and so forth. We have 4 distinguished speakers. Dr. Jean-Marc Rickli to my left, Head of Global and Emerging Risks at the Center, the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Above me, a few thousand miles away in Shanghai, we have Dr. Chuanying, Senior Fellow and Director at the Research Center for Global Cyberspace Governance at the Shanghai Institute for International Studies. We have Dr. Manuel Muñiz, Provost at the IE University in Madrid and Professor of Practice of International Relations. Hello, hola, ni hao to both of you. And last but not least, Dr. Sherif Kamel, Professor of Management and the Dean of the School of Business at AUC, the American University of Cairo. So just a big picture question to open up, and you can refer to the app for longer bios. So how does the power that tech companies hold, how does it sort of affect shifts in power dynamics, whether it be at a global order or otherwise? And if I could, I'm going to keep it open, but for the purposes of time, I understand our colleague in Madrid will be leaving. Our colleague from Madrid, Dr. Muñiz, could you say a little bit about how you view these tectonic shifts reconfiguring and evolving in the years to come?
Absolutely, and thank you, Adel, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I apologize in advance because of the changes in schedule. I can only be with you until 5 p.m. Madrid time, which is 10-12 minutes. But I'll be very brief. I'm very happy to be speaking about this, and I'm very glad that this was part of the program of the conference. And before coming back to academia, I was in the Spanish government for a little while. I was vice minister in our foreign ministry there for a couple of years until about a year ago. And I was fairly convinced when I went into government. I was convinced fully by the time I had left that technology is becoming a full domain of foreign policy, of international politics. So this is not a particular field, technical, to be addressed exclusively by sectoral or thematic ministries within our countries, the energy ministry, the ecological transition ministry, or the finance ministry, or the defense. I mean, this is a field of international politics. Now, the question is, what is the perimeter of the technology diplomacy space, or the tech and cyber diplomacy domain? And that becomes very complicated as a question. We worked with a framework when I was here at the ministry. We called it the 3 Ps of technology diplomacy, the first P being power. So technologies change the distribution of global power. It's the geopolitics of technology. They affect, for example, the development of defensive and offensive capabilities in the military space, outer space issues. The cyberspace is an entirely new domain of security. The second P we used we called prosperity, and it was technology changes the distribution of wealth globally. It changes the dynamics to attract and retain talent. It changes market dynamics and antitrust dynamics. So it's a major, major factor shaping the global economy. And in fact, Adel, to your point on companies, technological development is leading to a huge competition for dominance in the technological frontier across the world, particularly between China and the United States. But it also raises big questions about the role of Europe in that space. And the final P that we used was principles and political systems. So technologies carry with them, particularly in their deployment, maybe not in their design, but surely in how they're used, a normative dimension. So we are seeing very different principles and norms applying to the use of technology. And this is leading to a systemic collision globally built around the use of these technologies. Sort of how we use surveillance, how much is data aggregated, who collects, who processes, who owns that data. So if you look at this in the aggregate, this is an entire field of high politics now. And I think in the next few years and decades, we're going to see in foreign ministries across the world the development of specific teams, specific capabilities, the development of a very particular type of human capital, diplomats that can navigate both the technical dimension and the policy dimension of this. It reminds me a little bit, this is my final phrase, to what happened in the climate space. So climate began as a very technical space. dominated by scientists, the governance of climate change and other similar trends. And it's now a full field for diplomacy, right? We have treaties, we have governance mechanisms. I'm not sure how much of our international agenda is now the climate agenda, but maybe a quarter, a third. And I think that we're in the process of building this same capacity when it comes to technology diplomacy. So I think you have a very tough job, Adel and colleagues there in the room, which is to bring order to a field which is only just now emerging. And in the past, it's been confused with, technology diplomacy, digital diplomacy, which is the use of digital tools by our diplomats, and other concepts which actually narrow this in a way that is inappropriate, right? This is an entire new field, and our strategic interests and values are at stake in the way we manage this. So I'm thrilled to be part of this discussion, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing what the rest of the colleagues contribute to this, because it's a very fundamental issue. And if you do not understand this, my thesis is it's going to be very tough for you to understand global politics as we move forward.
Thank you, Dr. Muñiz. Just because we have you with us and you're leaving in a few minutes, I'm sure my colleagues won't veto a follow-up question. And if you could just say a little bit about the contours, the divides that we are seeing, and is decoupling hyperbole, or are we moving into something else? If you could say anything about that, and of course, the two powers are central to the discussion. So your thoughts on that?
No, I'm happy to address that as swiftly and as succinctly as I can. I think that decoupling is occurring. I think that it's much deeper than people believe. I think that it's occurring at the public level, the policy level, and the recent measures taken by the US on restriction of trade and technology transfer in the semiconductor space to China is just but one example of a very long-term trend of actual measures that are directed at constricting or limiting the level of trade, particularly in the tech space. But a lot is happening beneath the surface. So our companies are beginning to hedge the risk of operating in both the US and China. There's a regulatory hedge, regulatory risk, but also reputational risk. I mean, if you are Apple today, or you're a major company, a European car producer or a furniture producer or any other, and you have a footprint in both of these places, you have a big challenge of hedging the risk. And now, why do I think that this decoupling will not be reversed? And let me be very explicit. I do not think that at the moment there's any domestic political development in China or in the United States, or economic or security development in the region, or technological development of any kind that points to a decrease in tensions between these two countries. It's very hard for us to imagine a scenario in the next 5 or 10 years there is a lowering of tensions between the two. I think the fundamental drivers of this tension are, first, very strong economic competition, particularly for dominance in the tech space, particularly in markets that are oligopolistic or monopolistic, and that's a whole different debate, but they're very strong oligopolistic or monopolistic forces in the technology and digital spaces, and that makes the global economy much more zero-sum, so it makes competition between countries, unfortunately, much tougher in these two spaces. But I also think that there's a collision, a normative collision, a political systems collision, and a lot of it is underpinned by the deployment of emerging technologies. In the case of China, how much is surveillance technology used? To what level is this data aggregated? How much is this data used to inform public policy decisions? In the US, the fear is that a lot of this collection, processing, and usage of data is being done by corporations rather than the state. So you have sort of like a state surveillance model on one end, sort of a corporate surveillance on another end. But the bottom line is that there are very, very big differences in the way these technologies are being deployed. And that really sets up the world for a normative, systemic collision. You sprinkle onto that dynamics in the Indo-Pacific, and different colliding interests between allies of the United States with China, and it really paints a picture where there are going to be major tensions in the relationship and beyond. And the truth of the matter right now is that a lot of the global economy, in fact, a major portion of the global economy depends on what happens in the Straits of Taiwan and in Taiwan, and there's no indicator that circumstances will improve in the near future there.
Muchas gracias, Dr. Muñiz. Thank you so much. Very kind. We'll now fly either Iberia or Emirates via Dubai to Shanghai from Madrid. So I'd now like to go to Dr. Liu. And if you could maybe follow up on some of Dr. Muñiz's opening remarks around the power that technology companies hold and how that's affecting order. And maybe with a China sort of angle to it, if I may, sometimes us sitting in the Western Hemisphere feel that there are sometimes synonyms between state and company. So if you could maybe bring that and incorporate that into the discussion, I'd be most grateful.
Thank you, moderator, and thank you for the organizer inviting me to this conference. I'm really sorry that I cannot go together in person with you guys, and I hope next year we will get the chance to meet in person. And I do think what we are talking today is a very important topics. And to your first question, I think we need to define what kind of the technology we're discussing today, because to my observation, most of the technology recently we're discussing is actually our emerging technology, like quantum, like AI. It's not a traditional technology. So for those technology, they're different compared with previous strategic technology like the nuclear. Emerging technology are market-oriented, right? It's empowered by the data, and it do have the security dilemma, like cybersecurity, data security over there. So that's the reason why a state pay particular attention to emerging technology. So especially, in China and in the United States, the reasons are it's naturally they have the security vulnerabilities over there, right? It's created by human beings and do not experience the social evolutions of hundreds of the years. So there are a lot of the vulnerabilities there. The state are not feel safe about this technology, and also this technology are still fast evolving. So every country wants to be the superpower in this field. So that's the reason explained why there's the competitions between the China, US, and the European unions. By the way, I found out that the European Union also very emphasized on its technology sovereignty, right? So go back to the China and the US. I think there are some studies say that this split of the digital spheres and the global supply chain and technology ecosystem. Yes, they do have some impact because of the US want to decouple with the China. But if you look at the data, you find out that so far it only have very limited impact on bilateral relations in terms of the trade. We have been carefully look at the bilateral import and export figures. We found out that they are very stable figures between China and the US, and also in terms of investment, the volume are also very stable. They do have some decline in 2018 when Trump was the president. But right now, the U.S. investment in China are still growing, and the Chinese investment in U.S. after the big decline in 2018 and 19, right now is still a stably increase. So. And also another figures, the U.S. has right now has listed about 600 of Chinese entities into various of the list, like the entity list and unverified list, denied person list, SDN, non-SDN. There are a lot of the list over there. But if we did have made some studies of this 600 companies being listed, and there are only two, most of them are focused on two areas. One is ICT, including cyber, and as well as semiconductor, AI. Another one is the military, and including the space and the rocket. But if you look at the relation between China and the U.S., these are very limited compared with the strong interconnection between China and the U.S. So why the U.S. want the policy do not have our immediate impact on the technology or on these companies? We believe it's because it's really hard because
so Dr. Liu,
the US is a powerful country. But
sorry, Dr. Liu. So a quick yes/no question, which is the following: Does Chinese state support for the companies, the leading companies in China in the tech space, does it provide a competitive edge, or is there a bounded creative destruction of sorts?
Can you
does Chinese support, whether it be subsidies or otherwise, for tech companies, does it provide an edge, or does it have a distorting sort of feature around it in terms of distorting innovation?
I think both of them are there, because if you are Huawei, you are more global companies. So you may not like the subsidies because compared with the government monies, you still have a huge more money globally in global market. But in some areas, when you only have a very small companies, they are not so competitive. So the government subsidies are very important. So it depends.
Thank you so much, Dr. Liu. Now to come back to Abu Dhabi, and I turn to Dr. Jean-Marc or Dr. Sherif. Did you want to sort of add to the sort of point around company power distribution, power dynamics, and how that's sort of playing a more of a disruptive force in terms of global order and diplomacy and otherwise?
Sure, happy to. Right. We've heard in previous panels the discussion about whether we're facing a bipolar or multipolar order. I'm on the opinion that we rather see emerging an apolar system, an apolar system characterized by the fact that no actors have the ability to prevail across all dimensions of power. And this is the following reason. What we see emerging for sure, as Manuel Muñiz said rightly, is definitely a decoupling between China and the United States and the West. For me, for two reasons. Because of the last two crises. During the COVID-19 crisis, the West realized how much they were dependent on supply chain coming from Asia, and that when there is a problem, then in that case, health security was at risk. Likewise, with the war in Ukraine, Russia and China understood also that when the West get the act together, their sanction can be powerful. And so that led to the same conclusion that basically they also have to concentrate on developing their own indigenous industry. So you add to that the growing polarization and also the fact that China wants to become the first hegemonic power by 2049, although a Chinese panelist this afternoon said earlier, that creates the perfect storm for a major competition. And I also fully agree that technology, but not just technology, technology and science will be probably the most important metrics of power in the 21st century. So that is, in a way, traditional geopolitics with new forms. What is new, though, is that this technology, especially emerging technology, those that are relying on digital technologies, have exponential growth characteristics, and they diffuse very quickly, they democratize very quickly. For instance, you now have image recognitions that have been improving the last 3 years by more than 90%, while the price has dropped by 60%. Interestingly also, it's no longer just digital technology, but also robotics. For instance, robotic arms average price has almost dropped by half in the last 5 years. And so, once this technology, the price becomes cheaper, it also becomes more affordable. And what we see emerging is that suddenly that kind of capabilities could be accessible by non-state actors, by even individuals, and also by countries that were not leading in technology or industry and can actually find a niche by combining different technologies. The case of Turkey, for instance, with drones. So what we see emerging is this picture at the geopolitical level, which is, yes, a kind of bloc politics that we see emerging between China and the United States. Europe is almost inexistent in industrial terms, wants to be a leader in norms and legislation. And also, at the same time, you see a diffusion of this technology that empower non-state actors and individuals. Just to give you an idea, if Apple would be a country, it would be the 8th richest country in the world, and Microsoft would be the 12th richest countries in the world. And so that gives a lot of power to single individuals. We talked about Elon Musk, but this is just an indication of how power is being diffused through these technologies.
Thank you. Dr. Sherif, Dr. Jean-Marc was referring to science, and in the business school literature we hear about the war for talent, the old McKinsey paper from, I believe, the 80s. So could you say something around what this war for talent looks like in the tech space? So if you take, I was reading the numbers earlier, so if you look at the US and China, on current enrollment rates by 2025, the Chinese will graduate 77,000 STEM PhDs versus 39,000 in the US.
Yep.
So what does that tell us about everything from espionage to more productive scientific endeavor?
Sure, with pleasure. But first, let me again thank the organizers, the Emirates Policy Center, for putting together this magnificent effort. I've been there and I know what it takes to put together such a magnitude effort, and thank for the leadership of Dr. Al-Qadbi. Let me just step back for a second, and I'll circle back and answer your question. Since the morning, we've been talking about the future, predictions, what can go right, what can go wrong, and it's as if we're looking at a crystal ball. We know some things are going to happen, but we don't know for sure how they're going to happen, how they're going to pan out, and when. I should step back 24 years. I was sitting in a room in Geneva at the Internet Summit of '98, July '98, the INET of '98. And one of the fathers of the Internet, Vinton Cerf, at the time said, the whole world is excited that 140 million people are connected to the Internet. Wait until that number goes up to maybe 2 billion, and you have between 20 and 30 billion machines talking to each other. And then we can talk. At the time, the entire ecosystem that we have today will not be functioning, and we need to change the rules of the game. Because what happens offline is completely different from what happens online. He also said that laws, data, governance, talent will be key issues. And those who are going to run the show will most likely not be governments because they move slowly, but there will be probably non-state actors, probably big tech firms. So let's move forward 24 years. We don't have 2 billion people connected to the Internet. We have over 5 billion people connected to the Internet. We did not yet reach 20 billion or 30 billion. It's about 15 billion machines connected to each other. But what we've seen over the last 40 years, and people think that the acceleration of digitalization started with COVID, I would look at it differently. I look at it that the slow acceleration started 150 years ago when the first telegraph was invented. This was the beginning of different communication device. Of course, it went to a very slow mode of acceleration until the 1980s when we started having computers at home. Then the internet, then mobility, then social media, then COVID really pushed it far. And this is here to stay. So who are the players that are now setting the stage and making really the headlines? Are those who can attract talent, those who can invest in human capital at a scalable magnitude. And then they're reaping the results of that. Yet, talent itself will not play out. We've seen over the last few years the acceleration of the trend of entrepreneurial activities, innovative entrepreneurial activities, tech-based startups all around the world. So it's not just coming out of the usual suspects. I mean by that Europe, the US, Canada, China, and other countries, but also even out of Africa. We've seen what happened in Kenya, for example, with the fintech startup space. So it's all revolved around data, governance, and talent. Going back to your point, does the degree programs and the training programs offered today are ready to serve that scalable level that we're opting for? Absolutely not. And what makes it even more scary is that all what we've seen from the technology platforms over the last 40 years is just scratching the surface. We did not yet see what AI can do to virtually every single sector of our lives. It is becoming the driver. Well, do I mean by this that we're moving all into the digital space? Absolutely not. We will still be using the digital space to become more efficient and to be able to better utilize the resources that we have, starting with the human capital, which I think is, in my view, society's most important asset.
Absolutely. So I'd like either Dr. Liu or Dr. Jean-Marc to touch on this, and it's the point about governance and regulatory governance and data governance, digital governance. You're based in Geneva. Is this sort of idea that we've heard about a Geneva Convention for the digital space, or we've seen signatories in this region have not been keen on the Budapest Convention on the cyber side. How do you see that, and what is China's role in standard setting? Or is it going to be a matter of path dependency? Who you loan to and have adopt your model will naturally have, is that where we're going in terms of centrifugal forces, fissures and fusion?
Right, before I answer this question, I also would like to thank Dr. Al-Kabi for organizing this meeting and for her team to actually be so flexible and be able to organize a late night session for this conference. So regulation and norms are becoming key. Why? Because norms are dictating how you will use specific technologies. You might have heard or seen that the competition to replace the Secretary General of ITU, International Telecommunication Union, which is the UN agency in charge of developing all the protocols for telecommunication, he was Chinese, and there was a battle between the Russians and the Americans, because these countries have realized that being first in the game, defining the norms is very important. And so when it comes to Digital Geneva Convention, the issue here is, again, you have these bloc politics that are showing or demonstrating different perspective on, for instance, the core of what internet should be. The West sees internet as this ideal place of freedom and free access, whereas China, Russia, and other authoritarian states are looking at it from a more nationalist perspective, where states could actually curtail and have a control over the flow of information. And so what we see increasingly emerging is a clash between these different visions. And if you take, for instance, a debate I'm taking part in Geneva, the governmental group of experts on lethal autonomous weapons system, that, laws and the media, they are called killer robots. This meeting has been taking place since 2014, and what we've seen emerging is that there is absolutely no agreement on whether we should come up with a ban or not. And so I think increasingly in the future, we will be faced with such issues that are really, really deep, because states have realized that these technology are a force multiplier and a leverage of international power. For instance, what we see emerging now is the metaverses. You know, although Meta, well, Facebook, that transition to Meta, has some issues these days with the technology, but it's very likely that this technology will mature. So imagine that suddenly, well, you can reproduce totally Abu Dhabi in the metaverses. That's already the case. For instance, the city of Seoul invested $3 billion to actually recreate Seoul in the metaverses. Here you end up with lots of issues in terms of ownership. You know, if a country is spending a lot of money on branding its image, suddenly its digital image could be completely blurred. And it also leads to lots of, you know, security implications. You know, we could think about, you might remember the Mumbai attack, so we could think in the future that, you know, potential terrorists could rehearse the attack in the metaverse, but also just a simple fact, and I think that every country will be affected by this, is that if you spend, you know, hours in a 3D virtual augmented reality, how will you relate to your friends, your parents, with the states, you know? And this raises key issues, and I don't think that we have really thought about the implication of this. So to answer your question, yes, the regulation and norms will be a key battleground for this increasingly polarized world, because those who are able to implement the norms will actually have powers. It's always to be a norms entrepreneur than being a follower.
Thank you, Jean-Marc. Dr. Liu, could you say a little bit about what standard settings from Beijing looks like in the digital governance space, and exporting those standards, what that looks like?
So, we have been discussing these issues recently with a lot of the international think tanks. My answer is, no, global cyberspace governance is our, you know, kind of new issues. So we not reached agreement yet. So at the first stage, it's a very exciting, you know, moment. So you have a bottom-up non-built setting. Like you have the, you know, Microsoft initiate the Digital Geneva Convention, you have the Budapest Convention, you also have the Paris Call, and also China has the initiative on global data security. So you have a lot of the different initiatives over there. But we are now at the second stage. In second stage, we go back to normal. We need to go back to the multinational, you know, organizations like the UN, like the regional organizations to, you know, it's quite old, you know, stereotypical, you know, process. You need, you know, you will see the state negotiate with each other, compromise based on their national interest. So finally, it is the multilateral or multinational, you know, process will make the decision on the, you know, rules, norms, or agreement. Not the US, not the China, not the EU, not the Microsoft, the tech companies, right? China can make its own policy, but could not be the international. The European Union also the same thing, right? So that's my answer to your question.
Thank you so much. Just to get to sort of the more nefarious side of things for a second. At lunch, I was speaking with Dr. Sherif, if I may divulge, and I was telling him that I was at Wimbledon, not this year, the year before. And I was telling him that Tom Cruise was sitting behind me. And I wasn't saying it for no reason, because he'd anchored and mentioned deep fakes. And it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on where can this technology take us, and are we thinking about Mary Shelley Frankenstein when it comes to some of these developments?
Well, I don't think anybody has the answer. It's the $1 million question. And if any of you saw that clip that was developed supposedly by Tom Cruise online, it is not Tom Cruise, but it's AI, and it's sort of a negative implications on what can happen in society. Talk about fake news, talk about how you can manipulate and abuse technology. That clip, you can find it everywhere online, and you'll be shocked. You'll think it's Tom Cruise. It's not Tom Cruise. And he acts like him, he talks like him, he looks like him, of course, but that's just a simple example of what technology can do to us in the future. Not just a picture, not just a line, a news, but it could be a complete fiasco.
Jean-Marc, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, because I think deepfake is the best example for you to understand how fast the technology evolves. The technology behind deepfakes is called GAN, Generative Adversarial Networks, and that was invented in 2014. By end of 2017, December 2017, you had the first deepfake video that was uploaded on Reddit. And then a month and a half later, you had another deepfake video uploaded, but this time with the application that anyone can use. And so in a span of 18 months, you had about almost 15,000 deepfake videos that were found on internet. And they had been watched about 130 million times. Fast forward to March this year, a deepfake video of President Zelensky was broadcasted, where President Zelensky was calling the Ukrainian citizens to drop their weapons. So, if you were in 2012 as a military analyst or political analyst and asked to think about how will war be waged 10 years from now, how will disinformation be waged? You had to come up with a technology that did not exist at the time and think about what this technology could be, think about the implication it could have and how it would be used. This is how fast technology evolves these days. So therefore, for every people in government, but also in institutions and companies, investing in foresight, developing knowledge about possible future becomes key, becomes key, because even though the technology is not yet mature, at the pace at which this technology develops, you need already to think about potential consequences. And so, deepfake now is about video support, it's about audio, but now if you add the layer of augmenting and virtual reality, as I was mentioning, metaverses, we are primed for being, in a situation where you might have seen the movie Matrix, and in a way that will become more and more a reality, and it will be really primed for manipulation and for disinformation. And that is an issue for every government on the planet.
And if you were to pick a presidential leader, who would be Neo?
Probably, yeah.
Please, Dr.
Yeah, if I can just build on that, you can just imagine what kind of manipulation across different sectors that could have as implications in decisions, in actually seeing things differently, in manipulating how people think, how they can make a purchase or even study or even do anything in life. But I think we need to also address one more point. With all the positives we're talking about, and this is coming from someone who is by design optimistic, but we need to look at the world, and it's not just the digital divide that is out there. There are multiple divides out there, and the digital divide might just exacerbate that. When we talk about the impact of technology, we talk about the impact of technology around the world, and that means two things. It means access, but it also needs adoption. It's not just access. It's adoption and sometimes even the quality and the type of adoption. What we're talking about here can actually exacerbate those divides even further when we go and talk about the future of work, the implications of that. That should also be looked at, going back to Adel's first point, the talent management, human capital, the future of learning. who needs to learn what and how. Technology can actually, looking at the other side of what it can do, if it's not universally accessible. And by the way, I don't mean that even between countries. I mean that between countries, but also within countries. That could have devastating effects as you move forward. And I repeat, this is coming from someone who is all the time optimistic.
Now, I mean, your point on model adoption, I think, if we just go back to the Great Firewall of China, we've now got a separate ecosystem in terms of apps, payments, the way you search, you know, you turn up, I cannot use Google unless I use my VPN when I'm in Shanghai or Beijing. So, on that front, I think these impacts and these effects for third countries are going to be central. But as we sort of aim to wrap up, I just wanted to bring it to the region for a second that we're sitting in. For the US, you've got, you know, if you wanted to sort of push industrial policy, you've got government subsidies, you've got immigration reform, you've got talent visas, you've got all sorts. For countries like Saudi, UAE, Gulf states that have the financial wherewithal, Saudi Arabia spent 32 billion on ICT last year. By 2024, the Emirates is going to spend, I think, 24 billion. We know about the Minister for AI, we know about Group 42 and some of their endeavors and engagements. What are the ingredients for countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE to move away from consumers of technology to creators of technology? Whoever wants to pick that up, and we can take lessons from China as well.
I can go first. In short, fantastic opportunity. If I go in deep more, it has to start again what young generations should be taught and how. That's extremely important. Do I see the curricula across our region catering for that? No. There might be bits and pieces of genius here and there, some programs here and there that actually cater for that, but overall, we're far from there. But looking at as you said, the investment that is being put, the massive population that is young, ambitious, and we've seen many of the tech-enabled and tech-based startups coming out of the region over the past 10 years plus. And these, by the way, are playing at a level playing field with the big firms equally on the internet. Yet there has to be the enabling environment, the support environment that supports R&D, which is something that I don't think we're close to that. I mean, R&D when it comes to innovation is a big deal, and massive investment should be poured into that, not just in building the infrastructure and upgrading the infrastructure.
Thank you. Jean-Marc?
Yeah, I think all these points are correct. So if you look at Europe, for instance, in general, the education is really, really good. But when it comes to that kind of technologies, you know, Europe has a problem, even though that they produce more on capital of good research than the US. So you need, yeah, good education, but you also need an environment that is conducive for innovation. That means that you need VCs and investors that are willing to take risk. In the US, you have this. You need a regulatory environment that also gives you some flexibility. Sometimes in Europe, it's too strict. So there's a combination of it. And obviously, you also need, you know, young people, of course, that's the basis, but you also need to train them to, you know, to be able also to take risk. And sometimes this transition cannot be done overnight. You know, it's about injecting some cultural snippets so that they adopt that kind of mindset.
Thank you, Jean-Marc. Dr. Liu, how do we build a Shenzhen in the Middle East? What is required?
Okay, my official or academic answer is you need to find out your position in the global supply chain, based on the background of China-US tech competitions. But the Chinese experience is you need to have the young people who like to work from, we say 996, from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. and six days a week. I mean, the ICT industry is really, you know, you need to work really hard, and you need to, you know, update your software or apps very fast. So you need people they want to work hard in the industry.
Thank you. Before I ask my colleagues to say a final word on a final question I have for you, I'm just going to come back to all of you. And I just wanted to bring that question to the floor and ask whether you're optimistic or pessimistic or agnostic, or at least on the topic. Could you sort of just raise your hands if you think that the UAE and the likes of Saudi Arabia can transition from consumption to creation when it comes to leading technologies over the coming decades? Excellent. We have about a 50-50 split. Excellent. So I'd now like to come back for a final word, and the question is, rather than a word, is we know all swans are black in the dark, but could you give me one black swan vis-a-vis technology, digital governance from San Francisco to Shanghai, from Marrakesh to Muscat? What could we see in the next 15, 20 years that most policymakers aren't thinking of, aren't looking at, aren't considering? Starting with you, Dr. Sherif. One single thing.
Once we sit and relax in our comfort zone, nothing is going to happen. We need to take risks, go out of our comfort zone, think of the unthinkable, like you said, and then try to impact society. And if I can see one platform that can help realize that, is the triangle of people, data, and a platform for innovation. And a lot can come out of this region.
Thank you, Dr. Sherif. Dr. Liu, what do we see that we're not thinking about in the coming decades?
Yeah, I think we are still unknowing it, and the promising future, I think, is the quantum. If you want to invest, I recommend you to invest in quantum technology, because there are a lot of the uncertainties for the future.
Thank you. Jean-Marc, last word goes to you.
Yeah, I'm sorry to be a pessimistic, that's my bias, because I'm looking at that from a security perspective, but probably what government should be worried about is the diffusion of a game-changing technology in the hands of certain non-state actors, and it's not just, we talk about AI, but you have also lots of advances now in synthetic biology. And when you start playing with, human genomics without any kind of control, then we've just came out of a pandemic. Think about that kind of pandemics under steroid, that has been engineered or, maliciously used by non-state actors or individuals. I think that's something that government should keep that on the radar.
Thank you so much, Jean-Marc. So following the tradition of the previous panel, we end on a scary note. I'd like to thank Dr. Liu, Dr. Jean-Marc, Dr. Sherif, Dr. Muñiz in absentia, and mabruk to all of you for staying up, and now go and have your mishwi and your dinner and lunch. Thank you so much.
Thank you.